Hello everyone, hope you're having an amazing day. Today we're going to uncover a tense showdown where Yuri must stall an emergency shareholders meeting, while the real evidence is being moved just 2 streets away. Who controls time tonight? The law or Mr. Tuan? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. The city looked normal from the outside, motorbikes slipping through traffic, shop lights turning on one by one, the sky fading into that soft grey blue that always makes people think the day is ending. But for Uri, the day wasn't ending, it was tightening. His phone buzzed with Tuan's message again, the same sentence burning like a warning. He's not just moving documents, he's moving power. Tonight, he'll try to call an emergency shareholders meeting. Your family company is next. Yuri sat in his car near the curb, engine off, eyes fixed on the private office building ahead. Security at the entrance, cameras pointed outward, a black sedan parked too neatly by the gate like it belonged there. He didn't need proof that Mr. Tuan was inside. The feeling in his chest was proof enough. His other phone vibrated. This one was the investigator. Warrant is being expedited. Do not engage. If you have visuals of the case movement, send now. Uri exhaled slowly through his nose. He had already forwarded the clips Tuan captured. Plate swap, trunk transfer, the hardshell case being carried like it contained the soul of the whole investigation. Still, he felt the same brutal frustration. Because every time the law took 1 step, Mr. Tuan took 3, Tuan called. Uri answered instantly. I'm outside the new office building. Tuan's voice was low, controlled. Don't get too close. This is where he'll set the trap. Trap? Uri's jaw tightened. Tuan didn't explain like a storyteller. He explained like a man who'd seen too many people learn too late. You were bait once already. He tailed you to scare you off. If he thinks you're still nearby, he'll try again. Uri's eyes flicked toward the gate. I'm not going in. Good, Tuan said, because I'm still on the case car's route. I have one more possible destination. If it leaves this building again, I'll know. Uri swallowed. And the shareholders meeting? Tuan's pause was short. That's the real strike. He's trying to win control of your company before police can touch his evidence. Yuri's hand tightened around his phone. How fast can he do that? If he already collected enough shares through proxies, he can do it tonight, Tuan replied. Or at least force chaos, enough to scare investors, enough to split the board. Uri stared at the building like it might blink first. Then I have to stop the meeting. And keep breathing while you do it, Tuan snapped, finally letting a thin edge of urgency show. Don't become a headline while he walks free. The call ended. Yuri sat still for 2 seconds, just long enough to feel the weight of it all settle. A recording, a warrant, a case that kept moving, a company that could be stolen in one night, and people who trusted him without understanding how close the edge really was. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Tu Tieu. Uri hesitated, just a heartbeat, then answered. Tu Tieu. Her voice came out tight, careful, like she didn't want to break while talking. Where are you? Yuri's eyes softened for the first time in hours. Working. That's not an answer, she said, and there was something in her tone. Fear dressed as firmness. Tuan said you were being followed. Are you safe? Yuri glanced at his mirrors, at the street behind him, at the flow of traffic pretending nothing mattered. I'm fine. You always say that, Tu Tieu whispered, but I can hear it. Your voice is different. Yuri's throat tightened. He didn't want to pull her deeper into this storm, but keeping her blind felt cruel too. They cleared the safe 10 minutes before the warrant, Uri said quietly. Mr. Tuan is moving the key files around, and Tuan believes he's planning an emergency meeting tonight to seize my family's company. Silence hit the line, heavy. Then Tu Tieu spoke, softer now. So you're fighting on 2 fronts. Uri didn't correct her. It was exactly that. Tu Tieu inhaled slowly. Don't do it alone. I'm not, Uri lied gently. Tuan is tracking. That's not what I mean, she said. I mean, you. Don't carry it all in your chest until it crushes you." Yuri closed his eyes for 1 second. In his mind, he saw her face. Strong, stubborn, always trying to be calm even when her heart was shaking. "Where are you right now?" Tu Tieu asked. Yuri looked at the building again. Then, almost without realizing it, he heard himself answer honestly. "Not far from you." Tu Tieu didn't hesitate. "Come here for a minute." Yuri opened his eyes. "Tu Tieu." "Just a minute," she insisted. "You can leave right after, but if you keep running without stopping once, you'll make a mistake." Yuri wanted to refuse. Time felt like a blade at his throat. But something inside him, the part that wasn't just strategy and pressure, leaned toward her voice like a hand reaching for air. "Okay," he said. He ended the call, started his engine and drove. Not fast, not reckless, just direct. 10 minutes later, he pulled up near Tu Tieu's place. She was already outside, as if she'd been waiting in the wind for him to appear. When Yuri stepped out of the car, Tu Tieu didn't run into his arms. She didn't cry. She just walked close enough to see his face clearly. And then her eyes flicked down to his hands. They weren't shaking hard, but they were tight. White-knuckled tight, like his body was fighting to keep control. Tu Tieu's mouth trembled once. "You haven't eaten, have you?" Yuri let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Not really. She didn't lecture him. She simply turned, went inside for less than a minute, and came back with a bottle of water and a small wrapped snack. "Drink," she said, pressing the bottle into his hand. Yuri took it. The cold plastic grounded him. They stood near the doorway, the world quiet for one fragile moment. Tu Tieu studied his face. "They're really trying to take your company," Yuri nodded. "Tonight, if they can." Tu Tieu's gaze sharpened. Fear, yes, but also something harder. Resolve. "And if you lose tonight," she asked softly, "what happens?" Yuri didn't want to say it, but she deserved the truth. "If I lose," he said, "Mr. Tuan wins power. He wins money. He wins influence. And then the case becomes harder to push, because he'll have lawyers and connections everywhere." Tu Tieu swallowed. "So you have to win." "Yes," Yuri said. She stepped closer, lowering her voice like the walls might listen. "Then win," she whispered. "But promise me something." Yuri looked into her eyes. "What?" "Don't win fast," Tu Tieu said, each word slow and deliberate. "Win alive." Yuri's throat tightened. Throat. Those two words hit deeper than any warning from the investigator. He nodded once. "I promise." Tu Tieu exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for hours. Then she forced her voice to stay steady. "Where are you going now?" Yuri's eyes hardened again, the warrior part returning. Back to the fight. Tu Tieu didn't stop him. She just reached out and touched his sleeve. Light, grounding. "If anything feels wrong," she said, "leave. Evidence can be rebuilt. A life can't." Yuri gave her a quick nod and stepped back. He didn't linger. He couldn't. But as he walked back to his car, he felt something he hadn't felt all day. Not relief, not peace, just steadiness. He drove again, straight toward the office building near the city centre, the one Tuan believed was linked to the new hiding route. His phone buzzed mid-drive. Tuan. He confirmed the emergency meeting. "Location is your company's conference hall. Start time tonight." Yuri's pulse hit once hard. Another message arrived, this time from the investigator. "Warrant signed within the hour. Keep distance. Do not engage. Any new movement, report immediately." Yuri stared at the road ahead, jaw clenched. 2 clocks were ticking, one legal, one criminal, and Mr. Tuan was betting the criminal clock would always win. Yuri pulled into a quiet side street and made one call, his company's legal counsel. When the lawyer answered, Yuri didn't waste breath. "They're calling an emergency shareholders meeting tonight," Yuri said. "I need you at the hall, now. And I need you to verify every proxy and share transfer that comes through that door." The lawyer's voice tightened. "Yuri, if this is what I think it is," "It is," Yuri cut in. "And if we let them hold the vote, We lose control before police can lock the case. A pause. Then the lawyer said, "Understood. I'm on my way." Yuri ended the call and stared forward. In his mind, he saw Mr. Tuan's calm face at the warehouse, the hard-shell case sliding into the trunk like a clean act. He wasn't just running, he was attacking. Yuri started his engine again, because tonight wasn't about winning an argument. It was about stopping a takeover, before the truth disappeared into a suitcase and the law arrived to an empty safe all over again. The company conference hall looked too clean for a war. Glossy floor, white walls, a long table under bright ceiling lights that made every face look sharper than it wanted to be. At the front, a projector screen glowed with a generic welcome slide. Nothing dramatic, nothing suspicious, just the kind of calm that makes people lower their guard. Yuri arrived early, but not alone. His legal counsel was already there, speaking quietly with a junior clerk at the reception desk, flipping through printed documents with the tension of someone reading a storm forecast. A few familiar shareholders drifted in, older men in press shirts, younger investors with laptops, assistants carrying folders like shields. No one smiled. They didn't know the whole story, but they could feel something wrong in the air. Emergency meetings didn't happen in peaceful companies. Yuri's counsel stepped toward him. "They filed the meeting request correctly," he said in a low voice. "On paper, it's valid." Yuri's jaw tightened. "On paper." The counsel nodded. "Exactly. That's why tonight is dangerous." Yuri's phone buzzed. "Tuan. The case car is moving again. Same hardshell, heading toward the city centre. I'll confirm destination." Yuri stared at the message like it was a countdown. Evidence was in motion. Power was moving. And Mr. Tuan was about to stand in this room and pretend it was all normal. Yuri's counsel leaned closer. "We need to do 3 things. Verify proxies, challenge suspicious share transfers, and slow down the vote until we can confirm everything is lawful." Yuri's eyes hardened. "Slow down." "Legally," the counsel emphasized, "because if you lose your temper, Mr. Tuan will paint you as unstable. He will make you the story instead of his fraud." Yuri nodded once. "Understood." At the back of the hall, the doors opened again. Mr. Tuan entered like he owned the air. Suit perfect, hair neat, expression calm. Not a trace of the station's fluorescent coldness from earlier, because he hadn't been dragged in. He hadn't been questioned in public. He'd walked out of every consequence so far with the same smooth confidence. Behind him, 2 men followed, carrying briefcases and folders. Not sloppy, not rushed, professional. Lin wasn't with him, but the absence didn't soften Mr. Tuan. If anything, it sharpened him. Like losing a pawn meant he had to win the game faster. Mr. Tuan's gaze moved across the room, measured, then landed on Yuri. For a fraction of a second, his mouth twitched. Almost a smile. Not friendly. A challenge. Yuri didn't look away. Mr. Tuan walked to the front table and placed his folder down gently, as if he were laying out a dinner menu. "Thank you for coming on short notice," Mr. Tuan said, voice smooth and confident. "We're here to address urgent business concerns and stabilize the future of this company." Some shareholders shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in. Stabilize. That was a good word. A safe word. It sounded like protection. But Yuri could hear what it really meant. Control. Mr. Tuan continued. "We've seen irregularities in leadership decisions and financial management. Investors are nervous. Staff are worried. We can't go into the new quarter with uncertainty," Yuri's counsel whispered. "He's framing it as a rescue." Yuri whispered back. "He's framing it as a takeover." Mr. Tuan's eyes flicked toward Yuri, as if he sensed the words. "Therefore," Mr. Tuan said, "we will vote tonight on an emergency restructuring proposal. This includes temporary leadership adjustments to ensure stability and investor confidence." Temporary, another safe word. Yuri's chest tightened. He could already picture the result. Temporary becomes permanent, and the company his father built becomes a trophy on Mr. Tuan's shelf. The meeting moderator, a nervous board secretary, cleared his throat. We will begin with attendance and proxy verification. Mr. Tuan's man stood and began distributing sheets. Uri's counsel's hand lifted immediately. Before any vote proceeds, we request full proxy verification and documentation review for each represented share. Mr. Tuan turned his head slightly. Of course, he said, as if he were generous. Transparency benefits everyone. Uri's counsel didn't flinch. Then please submit the original proxy forms and proof of share ownership for any new transfers within the last 30 days. A quiet ripple moved through the room. 30 days. That was exactly the time frame Mr. Tuan had been operating in. Mr. Tuan's smile stayed. I'm sure everything will be in order. But Uri saw something beneath the calm. Calculation tightening, like a muscle preparing to strike. The verification process began. One by one, names were read, proxies presented, forms stamped, shares counted. Uri watched closely, not just the documents, but the faces. Some proxies were normal, trusted assistants, family members representing elderly investors. But then Uri saw it. A proxy name he didn't recognize, representing a large block of shares, another unfamiliar proxy, then another. Too clean, too coordinated. Uri's counsel tapped the sheet lightly. These 3 proxies are newly registered and represent unusually high share volumes, he said. We request additional verification. Mr. Tuan leaned forward, hands folded. Are you accusing lawful investors of wrongdoing? Uri's counsel kept his tone calm. I'm requesting verification. Mr. Tuan's eyes stayed on Uri now, not the counsel. Uri, he said softly, if you're worried, you should be grateful someone is stepping in to protect what your family built. The words were silk, but the intention was a blade. Uri's voice came low and steady. Protecting my family's company doesn't require taking it. A few people in the room stiffened. Someone coughed. The air sharpened. Mr. Tuan smiled again, small. Sometimes ownership is the only protection. His phone buzzed under the table. Tuan. Confirmed. Case car is approaching this area. Destination looks like a private serviced office 2 streets behind your company. Uri's blood turned cold. 2 streets behind. That meant the evidence was nearby while the takeover unfolded in front of him. His phone buzzed again, this time the investigator. Warrant ready, units moving. Do you have confirmed location? Uri stared at the screen. If he sent the location now, the police could move. But if he left this room, even for 10 minutes, Mr. Tuan could force the vote through and seize control. Uri's counsel leaned close, noticing his expression. What is it? Uri whispered. Tuan tracked the hardshell case. It's 2 streets behind us. Police are ready. The counsel's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. Then we stall. We keep this meeting from reaching a vote. How? Procedural challenges, the counsel said immediately. Demand identity verification. Demand notarized originals. Demand chain of custody for share transfers. Anything legal that forces delay. Uri nodded once. He typed quickly and sent the location to the investigator. Then he slid his phone away and stood. Not abruptly. Not aggressively. He stood like a man who belonged in this room. Before we proceed, Uri said, voice clear but controlled, I want to raise a formal objection. Mr. Tuan's smile didn't fade. On what grounds? Uri held up a document folder his counsel handed him. On grounds that there are pending investigations involving fraudulent manipulation connected to recent share movement and proxy filings. A wave of murmurs spread through the room. Mr. Tuan's eyes cooled. Investigations? That's a serious claim. It is, he said. That's why I'm stating it formally. Until verification is complete and the board confirms every proxy and transfer is lawful, any vote tonight risks being challenged and overturned. Uri's counsel added smoothly, we request a delay until verification is completed. Otherwise, the company exposes itself to legal risk. Mr. Tuan's fingers tapped once on the table. A tiny sound, but Uri heard the message. irritation. Mr. Tuan leaned back and spoke to the room, voice calm. "Everyone, don't be distracted by emotional statements. Yuri is under stress. It's understandable." Yuri's stomach twisted. There it was, the attempt to paint him as unstable. Mr. Tuan continued. "We have a responsibility to protect the company. Delays create panic. Panic destroys value." Yuri met his eyes. "Panic isn't created by caution," he said. "Panic is created by hidden moves." The room held its breath. Mr. Tuan's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting I'm hiding something?" Yuri didn't smile. "I'm suggesting we verify everything, because truth doesn't fear verification." A board member cleared his throat, nervous. We should follow legal counsel. Verification is prudent." Another shareholder nodded reluctantly. "Yes, we shouldn't rush." Mr. Tuan's calm face held, but Yuri saw the shift beneath it. He was losing control of the room's tempo, and control of tempo was everything. Yuri's phone buzzed again, a single vibration that felt like a heartbeat. A text from Tu Tieu. "Are you okay? Please be careful." Yuri didn't reply. He couldn't. But for a split second, her message steadied him, reminded him he wasn't fighting just for shares or pride. He was fighting to keep a future intact. Mr. Tuan turned slightly to one of his men, murmured something. The man nodded and slipped out of the hall. Yuri's gut tightened. He's sending someone to move the case again, to accelerate the vote, to do something that made verification impossible. Yuri leaned toward his counsel, voice barely audible. "He's reacting." The counsel nodded. "Good, that means he's exposed." Yuri's gaze flicked toward the exit. 2 streets behind this building, police units were moving in, but Mr. Tuan's man had just left. Time was slicing thinner. Yuri raised his voice again, anchoring it in procedure. "I also request that the meeting record reflect my objection, and that no vote proceed until the proxy representatives provide notarized originals and identification verification." A few shareholders exchanged looks. Some looked annoyed, others looked relieved, because slowing down felt like safety to people who didn't understand the knives behind the paperwork. Mr. Tuan's smile tightened. "Yuri," he said softly, "you're delaying the inevitable." Yuri's reply was calm, almost quiet. "Then you won't mind waiting." Mr. Tuan's eyes flashed. Quick, controlled, dangerous. But he didn't explode. He couldn't, not here. Instead, he leaned toward the moderator. "Fine, begin verification." And then Yuri's phone buzzed with a new message from the investigator. "Units on location, stand by. Do not alert suspect." Yuri's breath slowed. This was it. He had to keep Mr. Tuan in this room, focused on the meeting, while police moved behind him toward the real heart of the case. Yuri looked at Mr. Tuan across the table and forced his face into stillness. Because if Mr. Tuan sensed victory slipping, he wouldn't just lose, he would destroy everything around him to avoid falling. And Yuri understood something with brutal clarity. Tonight wasn't just a legal fight. It was a test of who could control time, the law or the man who had been running 10 minutes ahead of it.